Last year, when the RTX 3000 nvidia GPUs came out, my first impression was, wow, these cards are pretty noisy and they actually run pretty hot. Today, I'm going to tell you some tips that I found out in order to make your system a little more quiet so you can have a more comfortable gaming experience. Let's get started. Hey guys, Thiago with Classical Technology here. So today let's talk about sort of the noise and silence surrounding a gaming computer. Now, if you wear headphones and your system is blaring really loud fans, you may not care or really ever paid attention to it, but as time went on, I saw that sort of the performance that I would get in the system and my satisfaction with it was often tied to how nice, efficient, and quiet the system was. Especially with the new generation of GPUs from both nvidia and AMD, they tend to be very powerful, which means much louder running fans as well as just running hotter typically. Now, not every cooler or GPU will exhibit this behavior, but some that you really wouldn't expect to definitely will, and it's a little bit different than the previous generation. And now the new generation of GPUs is particularly offensive in terms of its sound and anything like that, because it just is more powerful and it just has to dissipate that heat more, meaning louder running fans or a very hot running GPU. If we take the 1080 Ti for example, it is a few generations old. If you take the reference cooler, that cooler also ran pretty loud and pretty hot because it was a blower style cooler, meaning that everything exited outside of the case. Now, there were third-party coolers, for example like an Asus Strix, which typically would be a lot quieter and run a lot cooler. With the 2080 Ti, nvidia did improve the cooler design to a two-fan design, so now the GPU also ran cooler, even though not the coolest at all, and it seemed to keep it reasonably in check. But as we get to the RTX 3000, we have many issues that are different from previous generations. They're just much more powerful, and they have much more powerful running VRAM. Now, if you run a 3080 or specifically a 3090, your GPU core may actually not be that hot at all, but the fans will be spinning up to 100%, specifically with the Founders Edition, like a Founders Edition 3090. The VRAM is what's overheating here, and this is going to be specific to sort of the thermal pads that were put in it. So let's talk about some things that you can do to make your system just overall run quieter, and generally this is also going to mean cooler. So first, let's examine everything that's in the case that's going to make noise, and even the case itself. First, let's talk about, aside from the GPU, one of the things that can get really noisy, and that's going to be the power supply. Now, Be Quiet sent me this over to evaluate. This is a 1200 watt power supply. Pretty incredible, but you'd be surprised if you throw two 3090s in here. You definitely want to have that sort of headroom. The most important thing about having that headroom is having sort of a silent running power supply, especially one that's going to have really beefy fans like they have on this particular unit. Now, previously, I have even used 1000 watt or 850 watt power supplies that I ran pretty beefy GPUs on, and while it handles it fine, even with that type of headroom, the issue is that the fans on the unit itself can get really loud. Even when I'm running a water-cooled computer, I would hear really loud fans, and I said, what's going on here? I couldn't really figure out why it was being so noisy, and as I sort of looked around in the system, got really close, I saw that the power supply I was using at the time was actually spinning up a lot due to the power that the system was pulling out. Previously, I never thought that the PSU was really something that would make a lot of noise, but it certainly is. If you're hearing a lot of noise coming out of your system and your fans aren't really running particularly high, check out that fan on the PSU. Sometimes it will have some type of eco mode, and it's only going to spin when it reaches a lot of power. But if you're pushing your system with a powerful CPU and the GPU, certainly that's going to stress your PSU as well, so that's something definitely to keep in mind. And of course, as you start to eliminate the noise in your system before we get to the GPU, you have to see how are you cooling your CPU. Now, you can throw on a tower cooler. Those are typically going to be pretty quiet. My preference is to use something like an AIO, depending on how powerful the CPU is. 240 millimeter to 360, usually in that range, will be more than fine. And here, Be Quiet sent me their 280 millimeter AIO. I particularly like this size because you're going to have the bigger 140 millimeter fans, meaning that it's going to be able to run a lot lower RPM while still pushing out a significant amount of air. Now, often a good air cooler can typically even be more quiet than an AIO because, after all, you will have some type of pump depending on the type of AIO unit that you're using. And by AIO, of course, I mean all in one, sort of the radiator setup with the CPU block. In this case, it certainly is a pretty quiet, and while you can get more quiet performance with a very efficient air cooler, I certainly like the extra performance that you do get with an AIO, as well as being able to put it in your case in different places and be more selective of where the air comes in. For example, if you want to prioritize your CPU temperatures, you could put it in front of the case where it's going to get fresh air, or if you want to focus on your GPU temperatures, maybe you could put it on top of the case as well. And then, of course, one of the things that are going to dictate the noise levels in your entire system, including the power supply, the CPU, and your GPU, that's going to be the case. This is going to be really, really vital because this is going to dictate not only how thick the panels are, so to block out certain high-pitched sounds or even lower sounds, but it's also going to direct the airflow. Certain cases are going to have different applications for different type of builds. Now here we're going to take a look at the Be Quiet Dark Base 900 revision 2. Now this is actually the second copy of this case that I have. Years ago I originally bought this case, but the only difference was it had the little orange outline on the side, which I think it looks pretty cool. It's actually right behind me here on the floor, and this one, the design is all black. Actually, one of the things that I really liked about this case was I did a whole water cooling setup in it. You fit a considerable amount of hardware. Of course, water cooling is going to be the ultimate way to reduce all types of noises in the system. This particular case, I plan to do an air-cooled build, and one thing to keep in mind in a case like this, you have to sort of really plan out the sort of CPU and GPU that you will put in it. It is extremely well insulated. You have very thick panels and padding in the front, on the side, and it does have these very intelligent sort of air channels like on the top and on the bottom for airflow to go through. But of course, it's never going to have a really high airflow like maybe the 802 case will, or like a fractal design, a Meshify or something like that. Those are going to be a lot more open cases, and in some applications may work a little better depending on the hardware that you want to put in there. But for me, this case is actually going to be ideal in a very particular build. I plan to put the 3090 Kingpin here, and that's the one that's a hybrid cooler, meaning that it's going to have an AIO, 360 millimeter AIO attached to it. And of course, for the CPU, I'm going to use the 280 millimeter pure loop cooler. So everything is basically going to be in AIO, and my main intention here is, in order to keep the case very, very quiet, this case really does have fantastic sound isolation. The panels are thick, the glass is thick, so that means that if the pumps in either of those AIOs are a little bit louder than maybe a typical air cooler would be, that sound will typically be more easily cut off by the thicker panels in the case, making it definitely a much better experience. And of course, you can position the AIO units with the proper fans on the front and on the top, and I think this combination certainly should work out very nicely. I could even choose to put the 3090 AIO sort of as an exhaust, maybe on the top. That way you can get that hot air not in the case itself. You can aim that air up at the top, and it's going to be a little easier to exhaust the tremendous amount of heat that something like a 3090 Kingpin will put out. And when you're working with a more enclosed case like this, an important thing to keep in mind is that you definitely need very high quality fans. Here, for example, it comes with the Silent Wings 3 fans. You need something that you can run at a little bit higher RPM to maintain that same type of airflow while not giving you a really noisy or unpleasant noise profile. If you have a very open case, then you can run your fans at a lot lower RPM, but here you likely will have to run these fans, especially with this hardware, or maybe a little bit higher. But then the idea here is that the case having a lot better sound isolation, you won't really hear those fans any more than you would with a lower RPM running system. That's why it's so much fun to build in this particular case, and optimizing it for really nice low noise levels while trying to keep the performance and thermals as good as possible. Now, in typical cases that are cheaper and not as well constructed, and there's no thought that goes into airflow and they have panels that are closed, those cases are often really inferior to something with a mesh setup or that the air goes through. This particular case is really amazingly designed. You can tell by the different channels where air circulates on the front, bottom, on the back. It really is a nice feat of engineering, and that's where sort of the high quality and high engineering elements of a case like this really differentiate it from other cases that may be more blocked off, but won't have quite the thermal performance and the noise acoustic performance that this does. So it's all about the hardware setup that you put in the case. Of course, now since it is more closed off, if you had a very hot running GPU spewing that air sort of in the case itself, maybe a typical air cooler, even if it's a 3080 or 3090, you may have a few thermal issues, maybe with the CPU if it's all exiting up top. But here, since both of the hardware that I plan to put in will have their own independent AIOs, I will definitely be able to control where the air comes in as the intake, the exhaust. That way, if I need to cool the GPU more than the CPU, or I don't want all of that 3090 very hot air to be within the case itself, I can easily exhaust it or direct it wherever I want. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.